Okay, chapter 14 is the nervous system. So it consists of two major divisions. You have the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and you have the peripheral nervous system, which has the cranial nerves, the spinal nerves, the ganglia, and the enteric plexus, and the sensory receptors. So the cranial nerves, these are bundles of axons plus the associated connective tissue and blood vessels that emerge from the brain. The spinal nerves that emerge from the spinal cord. The ganglia, those are the small masses of nervous tissue consisting primarily of neuron cell bodies that are located outside the brain and the spinal cord. Then there are the enteric plexus. This is a network of neurons located in the walls of the GI tract organs. They help to regulate the digestive system activities. Then we have the sensory receptors, and these are structures that monitor changes in the internal and the external environment. Okay, so histology of the nervous system. It has two major types of cells. You have the neurons and the neuroglia. The neurons perform most of the specialized function of the nervous system. The neuroglia support, nourish, and protect the neurons and maintain the interstitial fluid that bathes the neurons. The neurons, or nerve cells, have excitability, the ability to respond to stimulus and convert it into a nerve impulse or action potential. So the neurons range in length from less than 1 millimeter to greater than 1 meter. And they transmit nerve impulses at speeds that range from 0.5 to 130 meters per second. So the different parts of a neuron. Most neurons have three major parts. That would be the cell body, the dendrites, and the axon. The cell body, or the soma, or the perikaryon, contains the nucleus surrounded by the cytoplasm that includes typical organelles. Then the dendrites are nerve fibers which usually extend outward from the cell body, and they're usually short, tapering, and unmyelinated, and highly branched processes that emerge from the cell body. The dendrites are receiving input, the input portion of a neuron. And the axon is also a nerve fiber which extends away from the cell body. It's a long, thin, cylindrical process that may be myelinated. And the axon is, and myelination is, just think of like saran wrap wrapped around something a lot of times. The axon is the transmission output portion of a neuron, and it transmits nerve impulses away from the cell body. The axon has several notable features. So it joins the cell body at the axon hillock. The synaptic end bulbs and velocities contain the synaptic vesicles that store the neurotransmitter molecules. So a synapse is the junction that can occur between two neurons, or a neuron and a muscle cell, or a neuron and a glandular cell. The presynaptic neuron transmits nerve impulses towards the synapse. A postsynaptic cell is a postsynaptic neuron or muscle cell, or a gland cell that receives impulses. So pre transmits toward the synapse, post receives the impulses. Okay, classifications of neurons, and there's some really good pictures in your lab book in your guided notes section. The neurons may be classified according to both structural and functional features. The structural classification is based on the number of processes that extend from the cell body. So there is the multipolar neurons. These usually have several dendrites, one axon. Most neurons in the brain and the spinal cord are this type. Then you have the bipolar neurons, and they have one main dendrite and one axon, and they're located in the retina, the inner ear, and the olfactory area of the brain. The unipolar neurons are sensory neurons, and they have just one process extending from the cell body, and it's essentially an axon with dendrites at its peripheral end. So a number of specialized types of neurons exist. There are sensory neurons that respond to touch, sound, light, and numerous other stimuli affecting cells of the sensory organs that send signals to the spinal cord in the brain. Interneurons that connect neurons to other neurons within the same region of the brain or the spinal cord. Then you have the motor neurons that receive signals from the brain and the spinal cord, and they cause muscle contractions and they affect glands. So neuroglia. These occupy about half the volume of the central nervous system. They're generally smaller, but they're more numerous than the neurons. Unlike neurons, the neuroglia do not transmit nerve impulses, and they can divide in the mature nervous system. So brain tumors derived from glia are called gliomas, Gliomas. And there are 4 types of neuroglia in the central nervous system. Astrocytes are star-shaped cells that perform several functions in support of the neurons. They're most numerous. They are the most numerous of the neuroglia. Then we have number 2, we have the oligodendrocytes, and they have few processes, but they produce that myelin sheath. Each oligodendrocyte can myelinate parts of several axons. Number 3 is the microglia, and these are small phagocytic neuroglia that protect the nervous system by engulfing microbes and removing debris of dead cells. Number 4 is the ependymial cells. These line the brain ventricles and the central canal of the spinal cord. They secrete and aid in the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid, and they form the blood-cerebrospinal fluid barrier. There are 2 types of neuroglia in the peripheral nervous system. One is the Schwann cell, and the other are the satellite cells. The Schwann cells, or the neuromyocytes, produce the myelin sheaths around the peripheral nervous system axons. So each Schwann cell wraps about 1 millimeter of a single axon's length. The outer nucleated cytoplasmic layer of the Schwann cells is the neurolemma, or the sheath of Schwann. There are gaps in the myelin sheath, and these are called the nodes of Ranvier. These are nerve fiber nodes. The satellite cells, these surround the cell bodies of the neurons in the peripheral nervous system ganglia. So they provide structural support and regulate the exchange of materials between the neuron cell bodies and the interstitial fluid. Okay, gray and white matter. So if we recall the components of the central nervous system, it has some regions that appear white and others that appear gray. So the white is aggregations of unmyelinated and myelinated axons. So the myelin actually gives the tissue a white color, where the gray matter contains neuronal cell bodies, dendrites, unmyelinated axons, axon terminals, and neuroglia, all of which are unmyelinated. So therefore they're gray. There's no white from the myelination. So white matter is myelinated, gray matter is not. In the spinal cord, white matter surrounds a butterfly shape and cross-section core of the gray matter. In the brain, a thin layer of gray matter covers the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Organization of the nervous system. So the nervous system has 2 major divisions, central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central contains the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral contains the sensory and afferent neurons, which transmit nerve impulses from sensory receptors to the central nervous system. And then there is the motor or the efferent neurons, which transmit nerve impulses from the central nervous system to the muscles and glands. So your peripheral nervous system is divided into 3 major subdivisions, with the first one being the voluntary somatic nervous system, the SNS, which has somatic sensory neurons and somatic motor neurons. Number 2 is the involuntary autonomic nervous system, the ANS, which consists of autonomic visceral sensory neurons that transmit information from the visceral receptors to the central nervous system. The autonomic motor neurons that transmit messages from the central nervous system to the smooth cardiac muscle and the glands. And the motor portion of the ANS consists of 2 branches. This is where we get the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic generally supports exercise and emergency actions like fight or flight responses. Parasympathetic division generally promotes the rest and digest activities. Involuntary enteric nervous system, ENS, consists of the neurons in the enteric plexus that extend the entire length of the GI tract. The sensory neurons monitor changes in the GI tract. The motor neurons help to regulate the digestive system activities. So basically, the functions of the nervous system, your afferent impulse pathways would be like stepping on a nail. That's going to be quick, or I hope it's quick. Mine's quick. The efferent impulse pathways are like flexing your fingers. The neural circuits, the central nervous system has billions of neurons organized into complex networks of neural circuits, each having its own function. So in a simple series circuit, a presynaptic neuron transmits a message to a single postsynaptic neuron, which in turn stimulates another neuron, and so on and so on. So most neural circuits are complex. Look at the picture in your lab book there, your guided notes, and it shows you the converging circuit, the diverging, the reverberating circuit, and the parallel after discharge circuit, and take a really good look at the input and the outputs on those. So the diverging circuit is a presynaptic neuron that forms synapses with several postsynaptic cells. Converging circuit is in which several presynaptic neurons form synapses with a single postsynaptic neuron. Reverberating circuit is in which once a presynaptic neuron is stimulated, it will cause the postsynaptic neuron to transmit a series of nerve impulses. And parallel after discharge circuit, in which a single presynaptic neuron stimulates groups of neurons, all of which form synapses with a common postsynaptic neuron. All right, regeneration and neurogenesis. The nervous system exhibits plasticity, the ability to change based on experience, but mammalian neurons have very limited powers of regeneration, so the ability to replace or repair themselves. Neurogenesis, the formation of new neurons from stem cells, is known to occur in the adult hippocampus, but it hasn't been shown to occur elsewhere in the brain or in the spinal cord.